This is SAFM.
And you're listening to Literature with me, Karabo Kholeng. In this latest phase of political transitions in Africa, analysts rarely consider the relationship between religion and politics. The book Religious Ideas and Institutions: Transitions to Democracy in Africa seeks to address this need. It argues, among other things, that for democracy to be consolidated, political leaders must make the right institutional choices that structure the incentives of their constituents as well as their own, away from the antagonistic forms of politics or religious extremism. What impact do African contemporary religious organizations and elites have on their societies in terms of intergroup reciprocity and political bargaining? The primary objective of this particular volume is to analyze how such organizations respond to the political science and gestures of other groups in a like-minded manner, and the nature and effects of their negotiations with the state and other interests over contested matters. The authors of this selection of papers hypothesize that Africa's religious organizations can prove critical in the way their elites make demands on the state and in the way they help to shape the structure of intergroup relations in constructive or destructive directions. They consider the roles of both secular and religious elites and institutions in creating a political climate that enables elites to consolidate democracy. Now, we're going to try and have this conversation as simply as possible, because I'd also like you to take part in it by giving us a call on 0891 104 207 and send your SMSs to 34701. Your thoughts on religion and politics in Africa, and then what you think of that. And to help us with this conversation is co-editor of the book. She's Associate Professor and Research Fellow in the Center for International Studies at the Department of Political Science at the University of Missouri, Professor Ruth Eyob. Thank you so much for joining us, and good afternoon or good morning your time.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I am really looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, indeed. Now, considering that Africa is a religious continent in terms of its population and leadership, why does it appear that there is relatively little written work on the relationship between politics and religion? Is this actually the case, or is the discussion limited to academic circles only?
Well, I think one could say there is a lot of work specifically on religion and politics in different countries. But what is missing, as we argue with my co-editor, Professor Edmund Day Keller, is that there is not enough adequate comparative analysis that really explains how religion and politics interact to shape political rule and governance. And so one can say that it's not totally limited to academic circles, but what we've actually found out to be is that there would be a lot of research, for example, on religion and politics in Nigeria, religion and politics in South Africa or Ethiopia, but rarely have scholars put together a comparative analysis and linked it to which religion and politics could be used. Actually, religion can be used for good or for ill, as we say, because at a certain point, people and human beings use religion to make sense of their lives, of their public lives and their private lives. And when it comes to politics and political choices, it's a bridge between the political and the private. And hence, this makes it interesting for us to have this discussion in comparative terms, to say, how does it affect, for example, let's say, currently we all know what is going on in Egypt. We're still trying to find out confirmation of elections or not. And I think what we're trying to do as people who do comparative politics is to also say the same question should be applied, for example, to South Africa. It should be applied to Chad. And in this case, we are then able to develop a body of work that would help us to look at religion, not just as a private matter or something that comes up in elections, but actually addresses the role of religious ideas and institutions.
Is that the book's main point of departure, looking at that bridge between the political and the private, and how that is addressed in the institutions and, in transitional countries?
Well, yes, and what we are basically trying to get the public, the African public, the international public, as well as our fellow scholars and policymakers, is to say, can we go beyond the question of religious revivalism or political proselytizing, or discussing whether one country's religion or people are more conservative or liberal than the other? What we would like to do is to examine the conditions really under which democratizing processes are either facilitated or impeded. So in a sense, that creates the specific bridge that we're looking at. Because one of the ways in which our understanding of religion has been impeded, as I argue in the concluding chapter, is that people tend to assume that secularism is equated with giving up one's religions or giving up one's traditions. In a sense, we're trying to interrogate our understanding. What does it mean to be a citizen of the 21st century world? And here you have this concept of separation of faith and politics. What is the basis of the separation, if you ask, is the institutions. What does the constitution, for example, of a country say about the role of religious institutions? Are they prohibited from political action and activism, or are they placed under the same kind of rules? And so here comes the bridge in which there's an assumption or a recognition of people's religious value as an important factor. But it is also a way of looking at religion not only as a privately held belief, but also if you take religious ideas and institutions and look at how they operate in the political arena. So therein we find the most interesting aspects, especially on Africa, where we all need to look at it more comparatively and in greater depth, because the assumption until now has been either on extremism or liberalism. And those are, I think, the questions that we really would like to ask is, how do religious ideas and institutions, for example, contribute to society? For example, South African society, to Zimbabwean society, to Ivorian society. And by looking at this, I guess we're trying to put the focus on looking at institutions and how are they allowed or not allowed, or what kind of negotiations take place for religious elites to take part in the political life, or especially during elections or even between elections.
Now, when you say that people tend to assume that secularism is equated with giving up religion, I get a sense that we inherited that notion from, I think it was the end of the 19th century, where it became a big deal in Europe to separate church from state as a result of some of the discoveries that were being made in the scientific world and some of the ideologies, around democracy and human rights that came to the fore. But that has not quite been the case in Africa. Why is that?
Well, I would actually say that for example, the chapter talks, the last concluding chapter says, it is time for us to interrogate our understanding of secularism. And in this case, I think you're quite correct. In terms of looking at Africa, the idea of secularism is inspired by 18th century, European philosophers of the Enlightenment, and their whole concept, of course, after having gone through many, many wars, of religious wars, the idea was to separate, or to create what I would call a virtual wall between the physical and spiritual worlds in order to contain the wars. In this case, social thinkers and philosophers started to think about the only way to continue professing one's faith was to also assert that there is a difference between what is the sacred religion, okay, which is the private, and then, the political. And in terms of what happened in Africa is this separation, like many other political institutions, were introduced as part of forms of governance, as part of modernity. And so when you make your comment about it's not a big deal, I think what I'd like to say is that people assume that one has to have faith in secularism, and the understanding is it's almost like a wall between religion and politics. And yet we look at our lives and we find out that, religion is part of one's identity, personal as well as political. What is it that divides it is not the assertion that, one is a secularist per se, but the fact that what are the rules and norms and institutional laws that basically govern the relationship between religious institutions and political institutions.
We're in conversation with Professor Ruth Eyob. I just need to open up the lines so our listeners can take part. 0891 104 207. We're discussing the book Religious Ideas, the ideas contained within that book, Religious Ideas and Institutions, Transitions to Democracy in Africa. What are your thoughts? 0891 104 207. Do you feel that there is a disconnect between your personal sort of spiritual life and your public or political participation in the institutions of democracy as a South African or as an African? Give us a call on 0891 104 207. Send us your SMSs 34701 at a cost of R2. Now, I want to explore this idea that when religion and politics in Africa are brought up, the issues of extremism and destructive action usually come to the fore. But this is not always the case. Can you explain why, Dr. Eyob, Professor Eyob?
Well, because in a sense, I think religion or religious ideas can be used for good or for ill. Religious institutions and religious elites can be those people who bring peace, or they could be creating conflict. And I think in this case, one really thinks about South Africa. I remember being a young student and actually a young PhD at Emory University and running into Bishop Tutu. And it was one of those things where you would look at a personality like that who is a religious person, but also a political person. And so when you really look at it in the person of Bishop Tutu and in South Africa and the world, you have this idea that you actually have a combination of that. In many other places, there are people who may not have played that largely national and international visibility, but there's numerous people in both, who are members of religious institutions and who also serve as power brokers, as mediators throughout Africa. And I think it becomes really important for us to look at issues of either, cases of extremism or cases of successes and look at who are the political institutions and what are the political institutions. And we'll find out whether it is in Africa or in Latin America. For example, in the cases in the years of 1970s and 80s, when you actually had a level of liberation theology, there was an overlap. So I think what we try to explore in this book is when one says the word or thinks about secularism, it is not a concrete wall. It is actually talking about the separation of the religious sphere or the private sphere from the public. How do we understand it? I think we would like to ask the audience, our readers, and our colleagues to look at whether secularism as an institutional separation of religion and politics exists as a legal principle as well as a social norm. By this, I mean it's one thing to have something written in constitutions. There are some beautiful words there, but how do we get those beliefs and norms to be part of the everyday life of citizens? And that is this whole idea about civic education and looking at oneself. For example, the question that is posed to your South African audience, how do you feel that your religious beliefs affect or shape your political beliefs? It's an excellent question, and it should be accompanied, and maybe we can talk about this, to say, to people what are the rules, what are the norms that we have in our society that help us to negotiate or to bridge our religious ideas and our religious beliefs with our political beliefs. One's personal belief and one's larger, preferences for national politics, if that makes sense. And
of course.
Maybe I should stop here.
Let me go to the text lines now. 34701, your texts have been coming through there. Abu Kisa says, African Muslims have a right to vote for Islamic political parties. The West must stay out of Africa. It's too late for that, my dear. And Christians are the worst political wolf in sheepskin. Religion is political. They pray for women's submission. Extremism, says another one. Charles in Cape Town says, hi Karabo, the ongoing subdivision of particularly Christian religions reduces a consolidated approach. Adriana Bertioni says, read the Holy Bible, you will get the answer. All right. Now, looking at Christianity and Islam in perspective, to what can we attribute the continuing rapid growth of these two religions on the continent? Is it only a spiritual matter, or are there other elements at play here?
Let us say that, if one looks at the African continent, African societies and peoples had many different religious beliefs and religious institutions. And many political and historical events have taken place, but the fact that beliefs and institutions continue to exist. Now, when we really look at the Christianity did exist. For example, one of the earliest places for Christianity, which crossed over from across the Red Sea, is in Ethiopia. So Christianity is not necessarily a new import, but with the colonial period and the conversion periods and politicization of religion, what you actually was a rapid growth, especially with schools. And when you really look at Islam preceded, well, I can say Islam actually arrived again through the same arena across the Red Sea to the Horn of Africa and then spread. So when really, one was to look at the spread of religion, the same question applies. How was it spread? What were the institutional factors that enabled these two religions to actually expand? And I think what you said was in such an acceleration. But, when we really look at it, religion, in some areas of Africa, you still have the existence of both Christianity, Islam, and various forms of African traditional religions. And in fact, African traditional religions have not yet completely disappeared because we have come to recognize them as the basis for customary laws, as the basis for our cultural rituals and beliefs. But what we actually do not have, except in very few instances, is institutionalized religions. But I think one needs to be aware that in the study of religion and politics, it becomes important to look at which organizations or what communities do politicians try to garner a lot of votes from. And I think religion, whether it is Islam or Christianity or traditional religions, are pretty much identified by politicians, whether it is in Senegal, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, or even in places like Brazil. So part of this whole idea of looking at African traditional religions is how have they emerged into, for example, the 21st century? What are the cultural or political institutions through which people mediate, recognize them, especially during either elections or times of change, times of crisis? One notes that during conflict, for example, there's always a gathering. People go to ask for who can we have as intermediaries. And we'll find out that it is not just recognized members of either Christianity or Islam, but we also have what we call traditional leaders. So this whole idea that we would like to encourage is there seems to be a permeability, not only between religion and politics, but also this whole idea of earlier modes of religiosity and sacredness. There is a permeability that has existed and, in fact, has survived. So when it comes time to looking at political crisis, people tend to always get reports about extremism, correct? Because
yes.
people want to explain these issues. Rarely do people take the time, unless you are doing research in academic circles, to basically say, well, can we recall how in everyday ways that religious organizations and religious adherents are actually helping each other, creating peace, helping the poor, etc. And so to try to bring the question back and sort of try to understand the concept of extremism is when extremism occurs, it captures all our attention. And so the question becomes, in each case, how have religious actors and institutions contributed to either making peace or, contributing to crisis? And this becomes an issue of comparative analysis. And for most of us who study Africa, we look at South Africa and we look at the role of religion.
Now,
in
Professor,
the years preceding 1994.
Now, Professor, we can't finish this conversation without bringing up the issue of gender. Because it plays a big role in this discussion, and I need to ask, and there's a fascinating chapter that we can't get into because we don't have enough time to give the context, but it looks at women's responses to Sharia law in Nigeria from both within Islam and outside of it. But it led me to this question: is it possible to overcome the limitations that are inherent in a religious approach in advancing women's rights? Now, religious approaches often claim to be protecting women in spite of the glaring contradictions, not only in religious texts, but in the treatment of women in religious communities. Now, the paradox is that, as in the cases of sexual abuse of children by the clergy, religious communities tend to also protect those responsible for the ill treatment of women. How is it possible to overcome limitations such as these?
That is an enormous question, and in the book there's a chapter by Hussainatu J. Abdullah on the politics of gender, and that chapter deals with actually how have women responded to Sharia, and in this case, whether it is Sharia or what we're talking about in terms of human rights abuses, I think the question in this case is institutional again. And the idea is, rather than take this debate between politicians and religious elites, the question becomes, how do you interpret, for example, the right of women as citizens of any country, or of a country that is where you have constituencies demanding Sharia or religious law? What are the rights of women citizens in these various countries, and how do these religious injunctions or limitations, how are they restricting their rights of citizenship? And see, this kind of question then would enable us to avoid rhetoric, to avoid lampooning. For example, the entire Islamic world is not demanding Sharia. Many different countries and different constituents are. And so when you really look at the kind of, for example, punishments that have been reserved for women in the name of Sharia, the question is, how constitutional is it and how representative is it? So again, it helps us to really look at the way women in general look at the role of religion. And in any country, we have to be able to ask, women have the right to be equal citizens, and if so, how are their rights as citizens of the country in terms of constitutions interpreted, and what are the restrictions that are being placed on them by religious organizations? And in this case, then you're going to see that not all women speak in the same voice. And that I think that is the key issue to this conflict of women. And let me stop because you might have more questions on the issue of gender.
And you know what?
And I think in this chapter, let me say that there is a section talking about that when you really look at women's movements, they are a house divided.
Yeah. They definitely are. And, you know, we could have an hour's discussion on each chapter in this book, but unfortunately, this is all the time that we have that's permitted to us. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, Professor Eob. It was a pleasure having you on SAFM.
I am delighted, and I hope that this will open a lot of debate, and I hope the book will get reviewed. And please tell your listeners that, you know, we would be happy to continue this conversation through email.
Definitely so. Thank you so much. That's Professor Ruth Eob, who's co-editor of Religious Ideas and Transition and Institutions, Transitions to Democracy in Africa. Religious Ideas and Institutions, Transitions to Democracy in Africa. It's edited by Professor Ruth Eob and Edmund J. Keller. It's available from UNISA Press at 245 Rand. And you see, now this is where it just becomes, you know, texts like this, someone should be sponsoring the funding so that they become more accessible, because the price is a little bit prohibitive, and it is information and knowledge that I think we all need to, you know, grasp and get a hold of so we can see what kind of democracy and what kind of, you know, life we want to have going forward, because we have to acknowledge that, you know, these are the kinds of beings that we are. I just forgot to ask Professor Eob, where do the sort of non-religious people then stand? If you're somebody who's okay with everything else, but you're not an adherent to any faith, where does that put you in the mix, particularly in Africa? Because, of course, when you talk religion and politics, each continent, each country around the world, they have a different relationship with that. I mean, China's got its own relationship between religion and politics. Russia, it's different. Japan, Europe, South America. I mean, it's completely fascinating to see how South American public and, you know, public political power and private individuals relate with faith. Alan says political and religious elites fail because they have noble beliefs and terrible behavior. Thanks for that SMS, Alan. Lots to think about. And yeah, you can get that book published by UNISA Press.